So in the first section, as an introduction, what we're looking is we're going to take the data context. Why is it so important in the integration of development, and how data is taken up in a development context with the potential to accelerate progress, rather than just accelerate, also to enhance the current progress aspect. And then we'll also look at what it means to apply such skills in a career. However, before we open up the aspect of this presentation, we have to look at the components of what makes up data. In the other modules, my colleagues will explain the difference between data, the aspect of information, how it's converted into knowledge, and then obviously there's action. However, having said this, data in itself is just the primary aspect of how we go about being skilled into coming up with something which is real for decision takers, and prior to that, policymakers. So what I will look at in the first part of this presentation is the concept of W6H. So what's this about? What's W6H? Well, basically, there are 5 components, all with W and 1 and H. However, the 6th one is more on the implementation side of the data aspect. Remember that data is the primary raw context. Once data is given a meaning of the context within which it is placed, it becomes what we know as information. Sometimes people mix up this differentiation between both. People think that information is actually what we speak of as data. However, information is processed data in the context within which it exists. So it's given either a spatial, a temporal aspect. However, let's look at these 6 aspects. The first one would be what, who, why. Now we'll look more in detail on each of these. Where, when, how, and the last aspect will be why not, which is where skilled people in the data domains are more important for the next generation of society. Okay, so basically, within the huge complexity of a data structure, what we are doing here is splitting up this larger problem into smaller manageable issues. Okay, if one wakes up with a huge problem and just looks at the overall aspect of that, it would be unmanageable. It would be impossible to conclude. It will be impossible to have certainty of mind on how to tease out the different components. However, if that problem is split up into different sections, to different smaller components, then each one is more manageable in its understanding, in its solution, in its presentation, and in its dissemination. So let's look at the first 2. So what we have here is the what is data? What's the reality behind this scary or overused thing? Yeah? This word data. What is data about? This is what this course looks at. Most people are scared stiff of data because all they think about is numbers. Data is much more than that. Data is about text. Data is about imagery and all the components that these represent. Also, the what component of W6H looks at not just the data per se, but what that data is comprised of, what it actually, within which word does this data live? For example, what is the type of entity, as we have in this presentation, for which that data strategy has been drafted? Oh, this becomes a bit complicated. So if you're looking at the conversion of or the upgrading of an NGO, a non-governmental organization, or even a governmental organization, you're upgrading that entity, you need to have a solid foundation. And that solid foundation is the understanding of what entity, what that company, organization comprises, and how that data could be used within it. Okay, so that's the what. What is something? Okay, but then there's another component which is crucial, because even when we look at spatial information systems, which my colleagues would mention later on, any strategy, any policy, any decision which is taken without the inclusion of those persons who will be composing a major component of the progress from the past, the present to the future. Okay, without those persons on board, many a strategy has failed. It has remained on a shelf gathering dust, because one can draft any type of strategy, but without bringing on board the actual persons who will be affected and the client in its wider sense, who will be reviewing that output based on the data you gathered. Without those persons on board, no strategy will actually take off. Okay, so basically what we're looking at here are who are these persons? Well, it could be the data gatherers, okay, because a data is structured in design, okay, capturing, how you gather that data, cleaning that data, analyzing that data, and outputting that data, changing it into a readable form, something which is visualized, which we can see in beautiful terms. Today, with all these applications that help us transfer boring numbers into beautiful animations, into beautiful infographics, we have many tools for this today. Okay, so basically, who are the persons who are being affected, and who are those who are both designing and implementing that data strategy? Let's look at another two of these W6H components. Why? Okay, this is important. Why is there a need for a strategy? Why should we even gather data? Okay, data gathering is expensive, so we need to have a robust background on why something needs to be done. Okay, and there is where literature comes in, where feet on the ground come in, because you need knowledge of what's happening on the ground. Why should data be important for an entity? Routine kills data, because with routine, people get used to the process of enacting permits, of carrying out interviews for a specific NGO, for example, on how to develop a zone once incoming migrants start taking up specialized roles based on their skills. How do you go about analyzing all this data, and how do you change that? Why should you change? Why should you change that process? Because people are comfortable in a routine activity. Okay, so here we're actually teasing, why should a policymaker and decision taker partake to a strategy? Why should we change? Okay, we'll look at that in the last item. Then there's the important component of data. Where is the data being gathered from? Okay, no data exists without a spatial component, because it doesn't make sense. If one is studying, for example, 100,000, a tsunami occurred and you had 100,000 people in need. If that 100,000 on its own as a number does not make sense without the context, the where, okay? For example, 100,000 people affected by a tsunami in the island of Malta, that's 1/4 of the population. 100,000 in a huge country like China, for example, or India, is a very, very small part of the entire population. So everything must be looked at rather than as absolute numbers, but as ratios, okay, and rates. So basically, the where component, where is that data located, is highly important, okay? Is it something located in a central place? Is it distributed? For regional development, you have to look at the microcosms, the small streets, or townships, or neighborhoods, okay, or boroughs. But then from the local aspect, you need to go to the regional aspect, and to affect change top down rather than bottom up, as we were saying, local to regional to national. To affect change also through national legislation or supranational legislation, you have to look at the where aspect of how to affect each changes at the different legislative, executive, and jurisdictional level. Now, out of all these, there's also another context element, which is the temporal aspect. When was the data gathered? Sometimes in policy making, we come up with a policy which is erroneous, that you're looking at the current context with data that has been gathered by a census of 20 years ago. Every data needs to relate to the relative context when it was gathered. Okay, so the temporal aspect of data is very important, especially if you're comparing development over time. So you need those time capsules for your analytical components. Also, there's another temporal aspect where you have to analyze how long does it take one to design a survey, to discuss the survey, to have public participation, to publish, to implement the strategy. This is where skills are required. Now, apart from all these, because all of these could just be incoming secondary data, our main worry is always the how. How do we make sense of this information? How do we carry out a study? How do we carry out a survey? How do we go to our boss and tell her that my findings show X, but society is not yet ready for this? How do we push the boundaries? So the modus operandi, the way we work, is very, very important, okay? Because you have to ensure implementation, or again, the strategy keeps gathering dust on that blessed shelf, okay? Also, how do you go about using the top-down or the bottom-up approach, as we discussed? Finally, in this section, the why not? Because why not in itself says nothing. However, through experience of many of the collaborators here and the experience in the field, what we have seen is that once we publish something, once we draft something based on data, again, the policymaker or the decision taker would be reluctant to take up something which is groundbreaking, because one, routine is satisfactory, things are. If something ain't broke, why should fix it? In actual fact, this is the most crucial part of the data structure component. And this is where the skills are needed. How far can we go to push change, okay? We should not wait for change, we should push change. So the crucial element in data skilling is actually the why not factor. When we're faced with policymaker who says, but why should I change something? Our reply should always be, why not? Why not even try? Okay, this is how we keep society changing over time. Okay, so let's close this section.